How did you develop an interest in Mark Felt? I mean, I've been pretty knowledgeable, as I said. I've studied it. I've read a lot of books. Mark Felt is not a name that was front and center during Watergate as I recall.
Some people thought he might be Deep Throat, but he always denied it, and the scent went somewhere else.
And he was an assistant director of the FBI. He was, I guess, would he be the number 3 guy in the FBI at the time?
Well, number two. And when I was a young lawyer in San Francisco, in fact, the burglary happened 2 days before I started my first job. I became fascinated by it, and I felt that as a young lawyer that I should be able to prove who Deep Throat is through circumstantial evidence. And within a year or two, I felt I had a rock-solid circumstantial evidence case that it had to be Mark Felt. It would be too boring for me to go through the labyrinthine proof that I came up with, but I was quite convinced by the mid-'70s that Deep Throat was Mark Felt. I didn't do anything about it, met a girl soon thereafter, raised a family, started a law practice, and it wasn't until I'm sitting at this very table I'm sitting at now, and the person across from me was my daughter's friend. And as I was telling stories about my father's brief career with the FBI, he told me that his grandfather had been with the FBI and, like my father, chased German spies. I said, well, what's his name? He said, his name is Mark Felt. I laughed and I said, Nick, your grandfather's Deep Throat. Did you know that? So I went up to his house the next weekend to try to talk to him. Mark's daughter thought it was swell for me to do this. And so I began the process of trying to get Mark to admit he was Deep Throat. Then, after he admitted it, trying to get him to come out and tell his story. And then eventually trying to get him to commit to do it without Bob Woodward, who refused to acknowledge that Mark was Deep Throat. So finally, I did all those, and I came out with an article in Vanity Fair magazine proving that he was Deep Throat. So that's how the whole thing started. I'm surprised that no one else figured it out, because there were a lot of people on the Sen and nobody figured it out. I thought it was not obvious, but you had to put a lot of work into it. But if you spent enough time and looked at all the inferences, then it had to be Mark Felt.
So when you met with Mark Felt, did he acknowledge that he was Deep Throat?
It took a while, but no, when I started talking to him about it, I did it. I knew what buttons to push, and so I was there because I think I knew his psyche, and I started portraying Deep Throat as a hero. And when I first mentioned Deep Throat, his knuckles got white on his chair. He was an old elderly man with a touch of senility. His knuckles went white, but as I described how I considered and other young fellows considered Deep Throat to be a hero, young people that were in law enforcement, which I knew Mark cared about. He didn't care about the radicals. He cared about law enforcement. And I said, listen, I and all my buddies, I was a good friend of Bob Mueller's, who you may know as the prosecutor, but he was in the office with me. And my father's partner had been in the Saturday Night Massacre, a fellow by the name of William Ruckelshaus. So I could drop a lot of names. I dropped Mueller's name, my father's name, told him I was an assistant U.S. attorney, qualified myself as a law enforcement fellow. And then I said, we all thought Deep Throat was a hero because he kept our system clean. And when I did that, I could see his eyes melting as if I were giving him absolution. I don't think anybody had ever told him this before. And I thought I knew what buttons to push. I knew why he wasn't talking, I thought. And I knew what would get him to talk, I thought, and that he would not be sullying the reputation of the FBI if he came out and admitted he was Deep Throat. And so I finally convinced him of that. It took a long time. And believe me, it took a long time to convince him. It took a while to get him to admit he was Deep Throat, and it took a long time to get him to realize that he could portray the FBI as being the good guys. And once he decided that, then that he wasn't going to harm the reputation of the FBI, then and only then would he speak. So then he spoke, and for the next few years of his life, he was a very happy man because he'd unburdened himself of this and sort of basked in the glow with his family, which is, it was a lovely thing to see, very frankly. It just is probably the best thing I've done in my life for somebody else.
Wow, what a phenomenal, phenomenal story. But he really wasn't that type of hero, was he? I mean, he was engaged in really subversive political operations, it seems to me.
No, Woodward would like to characterize him that way as being, just a lefty guy who hated Nixon. Number one, he didn't hate Nixon. He liked Nixon. He told me that later on. He liked Nixon, and I always knew he liked Nixon. His deal was he did not want the Watergate investigation to be unduly circumscribed, contained. He wanted free rein for the FBI to do a full and complete investigation. In his first meeting with his boss after the burglary, he said, "We cannot whitewash this thing. The reputation of the FBI is at stake." Those words, which are in an FBI 302, constitute Mark's motivation. It's there in black and white. The reputation of the FBI is at stake. We cannot whitewash this. And that is what, so other people have come up with their theories, or people want to say, oh, he's out to get Nixon. He wasn't. As a matter of fact, if you recall this, to sort of prove I'm correct, if you recall the part in the book or the movie where Deep Throat comes into the garage and says everyone's life's in danger, you're going to be wiretapped, you might be shot. Woodward's notes say that he was talking about the CIA. Now, Woodward did not dramatize that in his book or movie that Mark was talking about the CIA. But at the time, that's May 16th, 1973, when they had that last meeting, Woodward did not report that. Clear proof that the CIA was involved in Watergate. He kept that confidential, only printing it in his book once Nixon was on the rocks and he could do it, and he could get readers and later moviegoers by the dramatic scene. And it was never really explained. But nonetheless, Mark was not trying to get Nixon. In this case, had Woodward published what Deep Throat told him, it would have exonerated Nixon. That's the interesting thing about it.
I guess I wasn't advancing the belief that he was out to get Nixon as much as he was, it seems, and maybe I'm wrong, but that he was providing cover to the CIA. I mean, if there was an investigation to be had and there was truth to be learned, it seems to me it would have been to have disclosed and revealed the role that the CIA took place or conducted in getting Nixon.
No, that's what I'm saying. Now, Woodward should have reported that because he knew it. So Woodward hid that, and the Post hid it. And my point is that Felt told Woodward that the CIA was involved, that they were threatening lives to hide their.
I see. Now you said that, and now I'm clear.
Yeah. So he was equal-handed about this. Yes, there was he had hypothesized that the White House was involved as this being a dirty trick, but it turned out it wasn't. His hypothesis as to White House involvement was incorrect. All investigators have hypotheses. Oh, it might be the husband, it might be the boss, so forth and so on. I want to investigate this. So what Woodward did is when Felt told him his theory about how it could be the White House, Woodward published that as if it were gospel truth, and that got people to believe that the White House was involved. It turned out not to have been true, and that was disproved. Then later on, when he got proof that the CIA was involved, Woodward didn't print that. So he went too far nailing Nixon and hid the CIA's involvement. So what I look at this is, what I'm saying is, my thesis is, Nixon did get railroaded, but he got railroaded by the combination of Woodward and, of course, the CIA. Of course, the CIA is going to not admit that it was involved. That's what the CIA does. And so if the truth were known, we would know that the only time a president has been removed from office, and he was removed from office, there's no doubt about it, through this scandal, it was done by fraud of the media. Now, the upshot of that today, we're sensing today, the media feels like it's a political powerhouse. It got its political power from Watergate. It's taught in journalism schools that we are this great watchdog for justice, and what we say is what's really important. And to a certain extent, they're right, that the media can affect presidential elections and presidential fortunes. And they tried to do that with Russiagate. So in a way, it's correct. The problem is that once you feel that your job is to exercise political power, you have to put on a jersey. You have to be on one side or the other. If you're exercising power, you don't do it equal-handed. That's not power at all. Power is saying my team is winning. I'm for the 49ers and against everybody else. So that's what's happened today. It's an outgrowth of Watergate. It's taught in journalism school that you're supposed to really influence public events. And I don't think that's a proper role of a journalist, but I get a lot of disagreement from people that are journalists.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. Who do you think killed Kennedy?
I actually believe that nobody's going to like this one, and I've talked a lot about it with people who have other views, but I still believe it was a single assassin. I believe it was Lee Harvey Oswald, and that there are explanations for everybody else. I think Howard Hunt was nearby. I think Hoover sort of botched watching him, but the FBI wasn't behind it. I don't think the CIA was behind it either. And there's good reason. Remember, about a week before Kennedy was assassinated, Lee Harvey Oswald tried to assassinate General Edwin Walker, who was a very far-right retired general. And luckily for Walker, who was in his study at the time, the bullet ricocheted off the wooden window pane separator. And they had that lattice type of window, and the bullet whizzed right by his ear, whereupon Walker hit the ground. But my point is, all theories about Kennedy's assassination assume that the hit was coming from the right, that the right side of the political spectrum was trying to kill him, whether it's the mob or the CIA or whoever. And in fact, Lee Harvey Oswald is what he appeared to be. He was a pro-Russia leaning guy who had married a Russian woman and tried to take out a right-wing general the week before. So if he tried to take out Walker, to me, the other theories just don't hold up. There's a good book by Gerald Posner called Case Closed, and I just subscribe to Posner's. Now, I've read other things about it. I've got a good friend, Mark Shaw, who's written a couple of good books recently about the CIA. My former boss, Melvin Belli, was connected to Mickey Cohen of the mob, and there's a strand there that as to the mob wanting to kill Kennedy, that Dorothy Kilgallen, the syndicated columnist who was clearly murdered by somebody with a drug overdose, that the theory that Mark Shaw has, and it's pretty compelling actually, is that the mob got rid of her and that she was on the scent. But now, what was she on the scent of? She certainly was on the scent of the mob. But in any way, there's some things. Yeah.
It's important to note that Dorothy Kilgallen was the only journalist to have ever interviewed Jack Ruby in prison after he was convicted. She returned to New York and called her friend Mary Smith, I believe, and said, "Be sure to read the paper this week. I'm going to blow the cover off the JFK assassination." And she woke up dead the next morning.
Right, exactly. That's where Mark Shaw goes. Now, I got to tell you something else while we're at it. When I was at Belli's office, I was doing research late one night, and I came across a box labeled Ruby. I picked it up, and I didn't have the presence of mind to copy it, but I spent that night and the next night reading it, and it was all the psychological workups on Jack Ruby. And remember, Melvin Belli defended Jack Ruby at trial, and then so the question is, what's Ruby's motive? And people say, well, Belli was mob connected, therefore it was the mob, doing this, trying to get a Ruby to be the fall guy and that kind of stuff. And Ruby was the guy that they used to get rid of Oswald. But anyway, I read the psychological file there, and I'm convinced that he was a guy who could go off on an instant rage. He's one of those guys that the drop of a hat would get inflamed and beat the hell out of somebody, for example. He had a hair trigger. Belli called it psychomotor epilepsy. But anyway, I've put all this evidence together, and I am not yet convinced that Kennedy was killed by anybody other than Lee Harvey Oswald, and that Jack Ruby's psychological profile was such that he snapped. Let me give you an example. Ruby would go into his nightclub, and some drunken patron would put his hands too close to one of the dancing girls. And normally that would, in another place, a bouncer might pull him off. Or if he did it again, you'd kick him out. But like Ruby, every now and then he would snap, and he would just beat the living daylights out of someone. He would snap, and he was odd, and the police protected him.
Let's add a few details to Jack Ruby. And if you have time, I'd like to continue this conversation for a bit, because this is actually something I know a little bit about. I was home from the fourth grade with the flu the day that President Kennedy was assassinated, and I sat in front of the black and white television with my mom for the next 4 hours, and then spent the rest of the weekend with my family. My dad and I actually saw Jack Ruby kill Lee Harvey Oswald on live television on Sunday morning. I believe it was about 10:30. I looked at my dad. He looked at me. We were the body English on both of our faces is, did you see the same thing I just saw? We were in a state of utter disbelief. But Jack Ruby was a member of the mob. He was from Chicago. He had mob ties that went back 30 years.
Jack Ruby was mobbed up, but he was a pretty low-level guy.
Well, be that as it may, and this was not an impulsive thing that Jack Ruby did, as I feel like you have sort of described it. He actually had been lurking in the jail the night that that Oswald was arrested. And as you are well aware, the first words out of Oswald's mouth is that I'm just a patsy. I will give you that you have touched on the one thing that I have no explanation or insight into, and that is his attempted assassination of General Walker. I've never been able to connect the dots, and still don't really understand what the connection with Walker and Kennedy would have been, and why you would want to kill a conservative general, and also I guess certainly at the time, a progressive Democrat. So that is a totally unanswered mystery in my mind.